August 8th, 1963, Buckinghamshire, England. The night is completely black. No moon. A Royal Mail train carrying £2.6 million in used banknotes is cutting through the darkness at full speed from Glasgow to London. In the driver's cab, Jack Mills is watching the track ahead. Routine run. Same route he has done 100 times. Then the green signal ahead turns red. He brakes. The train slows, stops. Mills leans out to look down the track. He sees nothing, just darkness and silence. Then a figure appears at the cab window. Then another. Then 15 men in army uniforms and balaclavas swarm the train from both sides simultaneously. Mills reaches for something. A kosh connects with the side of his head. He goes down. In the carriages behind, post office workers are shoved to one end at gunpoint and told to stay still for 30 minutes. They comply. At the bridge below, a human chain of men in the darkness begins passing mail sacks hand to hand from the train to waiting Land Rovers. 120 sacks, 2.5 tons of money. It takes 15 minutes. The Land Rovers disappear into the darkness. The most audacious robbery in British history is already over before most of England has gone to sleep. And in the farmhouse 20 miles away, where 15 men are about to count £2.6 million on a kitchen table, one of them is playing Monopoly with the real thing. This is the Great Train Robbery, the heist, the mistakes that turned every single one of them into a cautionary tale. Bruce Reynolds did not look like a criminal. That was his greatest advantage. He was slim, well-dressed, articulate, with a taste for fine restaurants and Italian suits that made him look more like a gallery owner than a professional thief. He read Camus. He quoted poetry. He moved through London's West End social scene with the ease of a man who belonged there, which he absolutely did not. He was born in 1931 in Charing Cross, the son of a trade union activist. His mother died when he was 4. He grew up partly in his grandmother's houses, partly in the margins of a city recovering from war, learning early that the difference between the men who had things and the men who didn't was less about intelligence than about nerve. Reynolds had nerve in quantities that frightened people who knew him well. By his 20s, he was one of the most accomplished burglars in London. By his 30s, he had graduated to armed robbery. In 1962, his gang stole £62,000 from a security van at Heathrow Airport. It was good. It was not enough. Reynolds wanted something that would define him, something that people would talk about forever. He called the Great Train Robbery his Sistine Chapel ceiling. He meant it. He spent months planning it the way an architect plans a building. Every detail considered, every contingency addressed, every man selected for a specific role. 15 men in total, each one chosen for what he could do that nobody else could. Gordon Goody, Charlie Wilson, Buster Edward, Roy James, a racing driver, selected purely for his ability to move vehicles fast in the dark. Roger Corddry, a specialist in rigging railway signals, and Ronnie Biggs, a small-time carpenter and petty criminal who Reynolds had met in prison and who had exactly one specific thing to offer. He knew a retired train driver. The inside information came from a man nobody ever fully identified. The gang called him the Ulsterman. He worked for the post office and knew the train schedules intimately. He knew that on certain runs, the Glasgow to London mail train carried vastly more cash than usual, used banknotes being returned to the Bank of England for destruction after circulation, untraceable, unmarked, already written off by the banks that sent them. The Ulsterman told Reynolds exactly when the big run was coming, exactly how much would be on the train, and exactly which carriages it would be in. Reynolds took that information and built everything else around it. The plan was simple in outline. Stop the train, take the money, disappear. The execution required 15 men moving in perfect coordination at 3 in the morning on a rural track in total darkness. Reynolds spent months rehearsing every element. He rented Leatherslade Farm, a remote property 20 miles from the target, as a hideout. He sourced the vehicles. He coordinated the signal rigging. He built a military-style operation out of 15 London criminals who had never trained together and would never meet as a group again after that night. On the evening of August 7th, 1963, 15 men left Leatherslade Farm in convoy and drove toward Bradego Railway Bridge. Reynolds sat in the lead vehicle and said nothing. He had planned every second of the next 2 hours. Now, all he had to do was execute. The train stops at 3:03 a.m., exactly as planned. Roger Corddry has rigged the trackside signal using a glove stuffed over the green light and a battery connected to the red. The fireman climbs down to investigate the red signal and is immediately grabbed. He is unharmed. In the cab, Jack Mills sees the men coming and reaches for something. He is struck on the head with an iron kosh. He will suffer headaches for the rest of his life. He never fully recovers. This is the moment the robbery crosses a line Reynolds had tried to avoid. He did not want violence. He specifically told his men, no unnecessary force. The blow to Mills happens anyway, in the confusion of the first seconds. It is the detail that will follow every member of the gang into their trials and define how the courts treat them. The train is separated. The front 2 carriages, where the money is, are pulled forward to Bradego Bridge by the gang's own train driver. Except the gang's own driver, Biggs's retired contact, climbs into the cab and immediately realizes the problem. He has only ever driven small local trains on the southern region. The Glasgow to London Express is a massive diesel-electric locomotive, completely different. He has no idea how to operate it. He stands in the cab looking at the controls in silence. Biggs stares at him. The old man shakes his head. They go back and get the injured Jack Mills and force him to move the train himself. A bleeding man with a head wound crawling into the driver's seat at gunpoint to move his own train to its robbery point. It is the ugliest moment of the night. Then the human chain begins. 120 mail sacks weighing 2.5 tons passed hand to hand in the darkness from the train to the Land Rovers below the bridge. 15 minutes. That is all it takes. Then the vehicles disappear into the Buckinghamshire countryside and the train sits silent on the track. One guard climbs out 20 minutes later. He runs to the nearest station. He calls the police. The call comes in at 3:45 a.m. By then, the money is 20 miles away in a farmhouse kitchen, and 15 men are tearing open mail sacks with their bare hands. At Leatherslade Farm, the counting begins. The money comes out in bundles of used notes, 1s and 5s mostly. The total is counted and recounted, £2.6 million, worth roughly £62 million today. It is the largest cash robbery in British history. It may be the largest cash robbery in European history. The men divide it on the kitchen table. Each share is £150,000. He had recruited a driver who turned out to be useless. They give him lightly nobody argues. The money is packed into bags and cases. Reynolds tells everyone the plan. Stay at the farm for several weeks until the heat dies down. Lie low. Do not spend anything. Do not contact anyone. Wait. It is a good plan. Nobody follows it. Here is where 15 professional criminals make the most amateur mistake in the history of British crime. They are bored. They are sitting in a farmhouse with more money than most of them have ever seen, and they cannot spend any of it. Someone produces a Monopoly board. They start playing with real money. They use the actual banknotes from the robbery as play money because there is so much of it that it seems wasteful not to. They handle the board. They handle the playing pieces. They handle the cards. They leave their fingerprints on everything. They also leave their fingerprints on ketchup bottles, on mugs, on door frames, on sleeping bags, on the mail sacks they tore open. The farm is covered in their fingerprints. The plan was to hire someone to burn Leatherslade Farm to the ground before the police found it. The man they hired took the money and did nothing. 5 days after the robbery, a local herdsman noticed suspicious activity at the farm and called the police. Police Constable John Woolley arrived and walked through the front door into what was essentially a filing cabinet of criminal evidence. The Scotland Yard detective leading the investigation, Tommy Butler, described it as the best gift a criminal investigation had ever received. Within weeks, Butler had identified every major member of the gang. The arrests began: Charlie Wilson, Tommy Wisby, Jim Hussey, Bob Welch, Roger Corddry, Gordon Goody, Ronnie Biggs. One by one, Throughout late 1963 and early 1964, they were arrested, tried, and sentenced. The sentences were brutal, designed to send a message about the audacity of what they had done. 25 years, 30 years, 20 years. The judge at the Old Bailey told them they had mounted a military-style operation against the state and must be treated accordingly. The combined total across the gang was over 300 years imprisonment for a robbery in which nobody died. Biggs received 30 years. He had recruited a useless driver and handled some mail sacks in the dark and received 30 years. Reynolds, Buster Edwards, and a few others were still on the run. Tommy Butler hunted them personally with a patience that bordered on obsession. He worked the case for years after he was supposed to have retired, but before Butler could reach them, two of the men already in prison made their own decisions. Charlie Wilson was in Winson Green Prison in Birmingham, maximum security, 30 years. He had been inside for less than a year when the London underworld decided to get him out. In the early hours of August 12, 1964, three men broke into the prison from the outside. They found Wilson in his cell and handed him a rope. He was over the wall and into a waiting car in minutes. The entire escape took 4 minutes. Winson Green had never had a breakout before. Prison authorities were humiliated. Wilson was driven to the coast and put on a boat to France. Within days, he was in Mexico City, visiting Reynolds and Buster Edwards, who were already living there under false names. 1 year later, Ronnie Biggs went next. Wandsworth Prison, July 1965. A furniture van was parked against the outside wall. A rope ladder was dropped over the top. Biggs was in the exercise yard. He grabbed the ladder and went over the wall and dropped into a hole cut in the roof of the furniture van. The van drove away. He was free 15 months into a 30-year sentence. Biggs underwent plastic surgery in Paris, changed his face, changed his name, moved to Australia with his wife and children, then to Brazil when the police got close in Australia. In Brazil, he discovered that he could not be extradited because he had fathered a Brazilian child with a local woman. He was untouchable. He stayed in Brazil for 36 years. He gave tours of his house to British tourists for money. He recorded a single with the Sex Pistols in 1978. He gave interviews to tabloids. He became the most famous criminal in Britain from an apartment in Rio de Janeiro. He returned voluntarily to England in 2001 in poor health and was immediately arrested. He died in 2013 at the age of 84. Reynolds was the last major figure caught. Tommy Butler tracked him to a rented villa in Torquay in November 1968, 5 years after the robbery. Reynolds opened the door and Butler was standing there. Reynolds said nothing. He had known this moment was coming for 5 years. He was sentenced to 25 years, served 10, released in 1978, spent his retirement writing books, giving interviews, and working with a band called Alabama 3, whose guitarist was his son. He died in 2013, the same year as Biggs. He was 81. He spent the last months of his life working on a book marking the 50th anniversary of the robbery. He called it his greatest achievement until the end. The gang received a combined 307 years in prison sentences. Police recovered approximately 10% of the money. The rest vanished. By 1971, switched to decimal currency. Most of the stolen notes were no longer legal tender anyway. The money the gang couldn't spend in time became worthless paper. Jack Mills, the driver who was caught, suffered recurring headaches for the rest of his life. He never drove a train again. He died in 1970, 7 years after the robbery. He was 64 years old. He never received compensation from the post office or the government. Buster Edwards came back from Mexico voluntarily in 1966 and surrendered to Tommy Butler. He served 9 years. After his release, he ran a flower stall outside Waterloo Station in London for the rest of his working life. A man who had stolen over £100,000 standing in a railway station selling carnations to commuters. Phil Collins played him in a film in 1988. Edwards took his own life in 1994. Charlie Wilson, the man who broke out of maximum security prison in 4 minutes, was shot dead in his garden in Spain. A drug deal gone wrong. He had spent the decades after prison trying to build a new criminal career and ran out of luck. Gordon Goody, one of the core planners, moved to Spain after his release and lived quietly for decades. He gave one interview to a documentary filmmaker in his old age in which he finally named the Ulsterman, the insider who made the whole thing possible. His name was so common in Ireland that private investigators hired to verify it could not conclusively confirm his identity. The man who started it all may never be definitively named. Bruce Reynolds called the robbery his Sistine Chapel ceiling, his masterpiece. By the 1990s, he was living in a flat in Croydon on income support, supplied by a charitable trust. The money was gone, the empire was gone, the suits and the restaurant tables and the Italian shoes were gone. 15 men had planned and executed the most audacious robbery in British history. They had stood in a dark field at 3 in the morning and taken 2.5 tons of money off a moving train. They had outplanned the post office, the railways, and every police force in the country. And then they left their fingerprints on a monopoly board. The entire case, one of the largest criminal investigations in British history, cracked open because 15 professional thieves got bored and started playing a board game with stolen money. The photograph from that night still exists. A bridge in the Buckinghamshire countryside, empty railway track, mail sacks scattered in the grass. One of the most expensive nights in British criminal history, and all that was left was an empty bridge and a monopoly board that nobody remembered to burn.